Okay, welcome to another episode of the As You Should podcast. My name is Michael Farrer, and today I'm joined by William Lakin, for who I've written an introduction, which I'm going to read, but if it's horrendously inaccurate, please feel free to tell me. So, William Lakin is a visual artist and postgraduate researcher at London College of Communication, principally working with the mediums of photography and sculpture. Through heavily experimental orchestrations of photography, lighting, post-production, and sculpture, he creates bodies of work that serve as a response to the ever-growing artifice of representation in society, looking to subjects such as online conspiracy, mythology, and masculinity. Current PhD practice is an exploration of online conspiracy communities and their impact in an age of ever-growing disinformation and populism. How did I do?
That was great. Yeah, no, very well researched and written.
Brilliant.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you very much.
Brilliant. So, can you sort of give me a roadmap of how you arrived where you are today? You know, would you consider yourself a photographer or a visual artist just working with that medium?
Um, yeah, my background is certainly in photography primarily. So I started photographing. Well, I started my undergraduate, my BA in photography in 2010 until 2013, and then I also studied an MA from 2015 to 17. And they were, the work I was making up until, yeah, I guess kind of 2020 was almost exclusively in photography. And I started off with, I guess, a documentary practice, but a kind of slower documentary practice. So I wasn't necessarily a kind of traditional um, documentary photographer.
Yeah.
That would go out and photograph certain events and things like that. But I would find a subject and I'd work on it over a long period of time.
So long form photojournalism, essentially.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, but
Yeah.
I guess more kind of I took a lot of portraits and landscapes and things like that. So that kind of, I guess, very slow documentary style.
Yeah.
Um, and then that kind of, I guess that changed for me when I started my MA, and I used that to kind of experiment with different things. And that's really where the interest began with the work I'm making at the moment. So my MA was about disinformation and populism, and I started making it in 2015. So that was obviously a very politically kind of turbulent time. It was the Brexit campaign was going on, and Trump's presidential campaign, both of which succeeded. And my response in Melee was the kind of, um, I guess, the discomfort, an expression of the discomfort with those events and this kind of rise of populism that kind of caught me by surprise, certainly. And I think a lot of people didn't expect either of those things to happen.
No, definitely.
So there was this kind of surge, wasn't there, around that time
Yeah.
of
And during
populism.
that time period, were there any sort of particular points of reference which contributed to the visual language that you ended up with?
Not really. It was a not particularly. Like if you look at that work now, it's quite random.
Mm,
A lot of there's not a lot of consistency through the work, and I think that's because I was really experimenting at the time,
yeah.
trying trying different things, working with you know kind of I guess hiding as much as revealing through photography, and this
Mm,
idea of not necessarily seeing the full picture. So it was a kind of, I guess, a visual metaphor for, yeah, um, that kind of polarization, and not being able to see what's going on the other side, which I guess is also very much kind of induced by kind of algorithmically curated news feeds and things like that. It's
yeah.
very, shows you a lot, but it also conceals a lot. So that's how that kind of, the visual language for that work started to come
Yeah.
about. So I was playing with exposure primarily, just underexposing things massively, looking for instances where there was a lot of contrast, bright light and heavy shadow, and just kind of really emphasizing that,
Mm,
and kind of moving around the world shooting in this way whilst thinking about some of these issues. Um, and then that project felt quite unresolved. So that was, yeah, I finished that in 2017, and it felt quite unresolved, I guess, because the whole the situation and those things, they were so fresh that there wasn't any distance to get any clarity on them in a way.
mm.
So it felt quite unresolved,
I mean,
and that's why I started kind of came back to similar things in my newest work.
with the sort of upcoming uh, American election, do you think you might return to that project at all?
Well, I can't. I mean, the work I'm making at the moment, I would say, is a evolution of that idea.
Mm,
It's definitely relevant, although um, I'm not necessarily in my practice at the moment responding to things that are immediately.
mm,
I'm kind of focusing on. I mean, to just give a quick outline of the work I'm making at the moment, it's about the kind of the storytelling practices of online conspiracy theory communities, and I'm using the Pizzagate conspiracy theory
mm.
as a case study, and I'm kind of dissecting the language used on forum discussions around that conspiracy theory. So that conspiracy theory emerged in 2016. So it's by today's standards, it's a relatively long time ago.
Yeah, I remember it well
Yeah.
actually, and I think that was pretty much the birth of that sort of hive mind nature of online conspiracy theory. I mean, I'm 24. I've been on Reddit for years
Mm.
and seen these things come and go. The most recent one being the Ocean Gate submarine
Yeah.
situation. The amount of material that was produced around that, a lot of it was it sort of showed that millennials and Gen Zers just cannot get through these heavily traumatic time periods without making something funny out of it. They just can't process it.
Mm.
Huge amounts of image making, and it sort of seems like in these spaces there's a self-perception of anonymity and security, and it sort of breaks down these moral boundaries that people have.
Mm.
So, maybe, when you're going through, when you were going through, all I mean, where were you looking to Reddit, 4chan, or when you were getting all the Pizzagate? Um,
It's a Reddit transcript, yeah. Although
yeah,
it's not actually on Reddit anymore. I had to source it
right.
in a different way. I had to find it offline, basically.
Yeah. Did you come across anything that you sort of looked at and thought, wow, that is absolutely horrendous. I can't believe these are people writing these things.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, absolutely. It was, some of the language is horrendous, and it's um, really hateful language. But one thing that did surprise me was actually the kind of diversity of the group um, on that specific transcript, on the Reddit transcript. Like, there were people coming from all sorts of different angles with it.
Mm.
They weren't necessarily like all the same kind of trolling, hateful people. 4chan seems to be a much more kind of um, predictable type.
Yeah, I
You know,
think because there's absolutely no boundaries on
yeah,
4chan. Yeah.
and that's why I didn't use the full, because there's plenty of stuff on 4chan archives that you can for this for Pizzagate as well, but it was all very predictably hateful and horrible.
Yeah.
Whereas what was interesting about Reddit is there were these hateful um, people and a lot of trolling and that kind of thing, but there were also kind of these quite a few of these kind of monologues where people were talking about how they were so confused and angry and upset with the world that this is where they'd ended up, and it whilst obviously they're kind of adhering to these very harmful and very horrible narratives,
Mm.
They are in a lot of ways expressing some very legitimate fears and concerns about kind of privacy and about wealth disparity and that kind of thing. But they've just been sucked down this rabbit hole of conspiracy narrative,
And
which
do you
for a lot
think
of
these
people I think is the
do you
only
think
way
these
to
people
stand
see
process.
themselves as sort of genuine revolutionaries?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
If you see, yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Bringing up the idea of self-image because that's a massive part of it.
yeah.
This kind of identity led um, framing of things and the kind of ascribing certain characteristics to themselves and to the groups and to their own group is a massive part of it. There's all these kind of one of the things that stands out most is this kind of binary framing of good and evil, and they kind of frame themselves as this kind of enlightened, revolutionary kind of
Mm.
cohort, underdogs essentially,
Yeah.
with this mysterious evil force on the other side, which is represented often quite literally as the devil, and it's this kind of eternal battle. But one thing I think is quite interesting about the way that they frame these things is they're so unresolvable, that the kind of claims that they're making are so fantastic and unresolvable and unprovable, that often it feels like this storytelling is actually more kind of this type of storytelling is more kind of manufactured as a way for kind of endless identity expression, and a place to kind of really express their their own fears and anxieties as well as their own kind of ideological stance, more so than actually putting forward a really um, kind of well-founded and useful narrative. These narratives are so fantastical and so ridiculous, but it doesn't really matter.
Mm.
As long as it serves certain purposes for the group.
So I've got written down in my notes for this interview a quote from Camus, and he said, "The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion." And
Mm,
like for me, that feels kind of sort of self-delusional. So maybe I feel like these people in these spaces are latching on to that idea
mm,
that you're so sort of in the belief that you're doing this great service to the world and making everyone free, that they will just believe anything and become embroiled
mm,
in the quite destructive behaviors, and
mm,
sort of lose sight of, going back to morality, losing sight of where the moral scope is.
mm. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a simple and convenient way to not have to engage
Mm,
with real issues, is by making a fiction that kind of gives you a sense of purpose and gives you a sense of direction and makes you feel um, like yeah, you're making a difference and you have some kind of some kind of grand insight in it. It's kind of it's intoxicating, isn't it, in a way, to feel that
definitely.
you're part of something big like that. And I think obviously, I mean, the idea, like conspiracy theorizing and the kind of underlying narratives, are much older than the internet and social media. But what the internet and social media, I think, has done um, to this culture of conspiracy theorizing, is that it's kind of overwhelmed. It's provided so much information, and it's so overwhelming that it's easier and it's easier to just kind of author your own reality, because basically you you can find more or less any information you want. Any kind of stance you might have, you can go onto one of these forums and you can find people that agree with it. So you can kind of choose what you want to believe and what you want to be reality, and you'll find, you know, you're more than likely to find someone or some other group to share that with.
Mm.
And whilst that's also very kind of liberating, and in many ways it's very it's fantastic that people are able to find kind of like-minded others so easily. It also allows people to be kind of siloed off into these alternative realities, and not, yeah, have to engage with a more collective vision of what might be real and what might not be.
Do you think there'll ever be a point
Mm.
where all of this sort of collapses and we start returning to a real point of real information?
I
Um,
don't know, really. I mean, yeah. I mean, that's the big question, isn't it? It's like,
yeah.
yeah. And I think, I mean, at the moment, it's kind of hard to see, because at the moment, the efforts to kind of combat misinformation, disinformation are based around the idea of, policing online spaces or debunking. But so often for these groups, those efforts are actually absorbed into the theory as evidence of the theory. They're trying to stop this information, therefore we must be onto something.
Mm.
That's one of the common ways that conspiracy theorists tend to kind of spin certain efforts to debunk and things like that. It's like a turning something on its head to make it do more or less the opposite of what it was intended to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's hard to see how those efforts might break through that. And that's one of the things that's one of the reasons I'm approaching my my work at the moment from this standpoint of narrative and of storytelling and interpretation, rather than necessarily trying to deal with and debunk the specifics of the theory. It's more about how the theories are functioning, what purposes they serve, and why people engage in them. The why rather than the what, because I think that can, I hope that it can give a productive alternative view of this culture, and make people potentially stop and think about motivations rather than the kind of emotive contents of these theories. It's easy to see these theories and be kind of, well, either drawn in by them or disgusted and reject, just kind of want to reject them and push them aside. But like I was saying about dissecting these Pizzagate forum conversations, there's a broad range of reasons that people are engaging with this stuff, and some people, it's clear that certain kind of emotional needs are just not being met. They're dissatisfied and they're unhappy, and they've been captured by this conspiratorial um, kind of framing of the world, and that's a shame. I think some people do genuinely think that they're doing good by engaging with these things, and doing the world a service. And it's sad that it's so um, that they're being misled in that way.
Yeah. And there's
Mm.
so I want to ask about the sloganism and how you've integrated that into the sculpture work.
Mm.
And what is there any sort of connection between the materials that you're choosing to work with and the actual content of the slogans, and also the sort of the arrangement of them as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the um, the sculptures really came out of out of looking for a more interesting way to present the text. Rather than just printing the text and putting it on the wall, I wanted to look for a way where it could be more of a kind of a bit more engaging and more of a kind of physical object in the space. I wanted it to take more prominence rather than the text just accompanying the photographs. I wanted the text to be, um, you know, as important and as visual as the photographs, essentially. So the text is meant to the pieces of text that I've chosen are meant to communicate a fairly indirect way some of the ways in which the Pizzagate discussion functions. So the way in which maybe the forum users interpret information, or the kind of language they use and to kind of motivate and energize the group. There's a lot of that kind of very heavy rhetoric, which is not necessarily um, constructively adding to the narrative, but which is just meant to energize the group and keep them kind of interested and excited about the prospect of uncovering this theory.
There were patterns in the language being used, throughout the forum that
Mm.
was getting sort of um, s- the most reaction out of people. Is there?
Yeah, yeah, there were, a lot of it is, like I said earlier, kind of binary framing of good and evil. That
Yeah.
that was obviously very effective. A lot of that also strayed into very explicit kind of religious rhetoric as well, sometimes actually quoting the Bible, um, and 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 also using very, very serious and lewd kind of accusations. The more kind of outrageous the accusation, the more kind of energized and motivated the group seemed to be.
Mm.
And then there was also a lot of policing as well. Actually, it's interesting that there was, the people that were contributing to the forum, more or less 99% had the same ideas and the same underlying kind of theory, but there was often kind of arguments about the specifics. And also, if someone tried to kind of discount the theory entirely, they were very quickly kind of shut down and called things like a shill. They thought that anyone that criticizing the theory must have been planted by the government to stir things up in the forum. So it's all this kind of spinning of information to keep it on track and to keep it alive. It's very much a kind of ecosystem. It took maintenance. It wasn't just there kind of trundling along and freewheeling. It very much took a lot of effort to keep it relevant, to keep it um, interesting for the group. And so, yeah, I tried to communicate that through the text and through the sculpture pieces. And then the actual materials. When I was analysing the work, one of the kind of overriding theme that I thought explained how the forum was functioning was this idea of world building. It's this building this alternative reality, much like kind of sci-fi writers do. They're building, uh, you know, they're coming up with characters. They're making their own rules, their own kind of logic, and they're kind of illustrating this world that they believe they're kind of inhabiting. And so, yeah, this world building idea really influenced the materials that I was using as well. So the sculptures are made out of acrylic and um, clear acrylic, which is meant to look like glass. So it's got kind of green edges and it looks like glass. And then concrete as well, and these kind of big metal stainless steel bolts. And so these are all materials that are involved in construction. Essentially, they're meant to look like construction materials, and the objects, particularly like the tower piece that I made, is meant to look like some kind of construction, something that's been built, and it's built in layers as well. That's another kind of reference to kind of the layered nature of conspiracy narratives. They've got so many different kind of um, so many different things that they're pulling in from history, popular culture, fiction. They build up these different layers of narrative, different layers of kind of content, and so that the kind of the physicality of the pieces, both the materials and the way they're built, is meant to communicate that idea of um, world building, of constructing something physical from these building materials.
And are they intended as pieces that you want audience members to actually touch and interact with and get sort of a sense of the narrative through that as well?
Not necessarily touch, because one or two of them are quite fragile.
Right.
So I prefer people don't necessarily touch it because they could easily snap. They're
Yeah.
not. I've used building materials, but not in a. I'm not in any way kind of. Um, I have no experience to kind of engineer them in a way that is actually strong. So
Mm,
some of them are actually quite fragile. So for that reason, I don't really expect people to touch them. But I am thinking, I am at the moment planning some more interactive pieces, things that people can, yeah, actually come into the space and interact with. And I should have some of those made. I'm doing a workshop in a conference in July around these pieces, these interactive pieces, which I have thought about but haven't actually made yet. So the next few months is going to be really kind of pressured trying to get that done. But the idea of doing that is that people are in the space and they're looking at the work. They'll be presented with the work I already have. But there's a kind of a dialogic element to them. The idea that these pieces are there for people to interact with and provoke a dialogue around the subject and around the pieces. And the reason I wanted to do that is just this idea of group narrative building. So a lot of the interactive pieces I'm planning, they'll participants will be encouraged to kind of build something together, and it's the idea that it's this kind of um, embodying this idea of building a narrative and building something in a group, but in a way that's not kind of online, anonymous, um, and kind of um, funneled down this shut off kind of online space. It's
mm,
more about having people in a space and having a constructive dialogue where people can empathize, I guess, more with one another and talk about the subject whilst they're doing something and creating together. So it's about creating empathy and connection out of something which is, by its nature, very polarizing and very, um, yeah, kind of siloed off into its own little world.
mhm.
But they're very unresolved. So right now, this is
Yeah,
my next stage to
yeah.
get kind of made. Yeah.
So what's the next stage with the image making? Have you got anything in mind there?
Not really, to be honest. The photographs, I haven't taken any new photographs for a while. I've been working on the sculpture pieces for the last kind of 18 months. I've been almost exclusively working on the sculpture pieces, although I've been, working digitally in post-production and printing the photographs. So yeah, not. There's no plans as of yet with the visual kind of the kind of imagery to do any more or expand that right now. But I'm kind of experimenting with things in the background with kind of AI and also 3D modeling and 3D scanning and stuff like that.
Mhm.
I'm not sure how that will feed in, but I'm just kind of yeah, on my own, kind of experimenting with other kind of ways of image making, ways that are kind of I guess I'm interested in making images. I'm interested in photography because of its relationship to reality and the fact that it's the way people read it is, there's something that was photographed. It has some kind of relationship to truth and reality. So I like the fact that photography does that. But I'm also very interested in um, new technologies and new ways of producing realistic imagery, which isn't
Mm.
necessarily photography. And I'm not 100% sure how that's going to fit into the project yet, but it's something that I've been interested in for a couple of years, and I'm trying to kind of work out in the background.
With the image making that you've done so far,
Mm.
how did you negotiate taking all this language and this phraseology from those online communities and then actually making that um, into a visual language?
Mm.
Did you have any sort of points of reference? Any other artists that you're looking at? Um, you photographed the sculptures themselves.
Mm.
Um, I mean, I need to pull pull open and have a look again. But yeah, so how did
Yeah.
you negotiate taking all of that language and building a
The
photo
language, I guess,
process?
the kind of the visual language of it. God, it was a long time ago now that I started working on it. I'm not really like it. It kind of grew very quite organically, really. I just started messing around and playing with still life and shooting in the studio, and the images never looked really um, like I imagined them, and that's one thing I kind of had to kind of teach myself to do. Really, is not be attached to your idea, like the kind of initial idea, and just let things kind of grow organically in the studio and work with them. I think actually one of my main references visually, thinking about it, was at the beginning of the project. I was looking at and still recently as well. It's a key part of the narrative, is this satanic element
Right.
of conspiracy culture.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons the kind of satanic element is so potent is because it's been used over and over again over generations to kind of frame. It's a very kind of Christian framing of anything that is, considered deviant and non-Christian. It's, name it satanic, basically. So in the 80s and the 90s, there was this period called the Satanic Panics, where conservative Christian communities, mainly in the US, were kind of circulating this theory that children were being abused by satanic cults, which were operating out of daycare centres. And there was never any evidence for it. It was this kind of mad rumor that kind of was running rife in these communities. And it was very much energized by infotainment television. So these television shows, things like the Geraldo Rivera show and 2020, they were they looked like documentaries, but often they were situated in the entertainment division of channels. So they took on the visual language of kind of news programming and documentaries, but they didn't have the kind of restrictions that news and documentaries had of being, unbiased and, only putting forward kind of evidence-based theories and facts. So they were allowed to say whatever they wanted, and they really kind of energized this culture. And one thing that they often did is play with really, really kind of extreme, heavy, overloaded, emotive visuals, and the pace of the shows were really quick. So they would have all these kind of flashing visuals of like exorcisms in the US, and dead animals on farms that they thought satanic cults had sacrificed, and derelict buildings with graffiti in, little kind of I guess like signifiers and symbols. And it was a very kind of potent mix of this very American conservative Christian view of what Satanism was, but it just everything was just lumped in with it,
Hmm.
like makeshift crosses and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so it's this idea of this kind of visual language of picking these little things that occur, and these little things that people have kind of finding to illustrate this idea of Satanism. That's where a lot of the visual language came from initially. So there's a lot of kind of images in my work which look like little rituals,
Hmm.
little sculptures, or little, there's smoke, or kind of just a piece of wood, like a log or something.
Mm.
It's like talismanic. Um, and yeah, so that's where the visual language really came from. Um, Graffiti as well. I use in a couple of pictures. I just make patterns with a can of spray paint on various things and kind of mess with it. And so it's really about that kind of it, the visual language is taken from that very ambiguous and very kind of heady mix of supposed satanic influences proposed by this kind of Christian conservative framing of evil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like a very sort of common point of reference for just bombarding people with information, and it's almost like a very strategic way of inciting fear in
Mm,
people. It's a really clever way of controlling people, essentially, is to give them something to be absolutely terrified of.
yeah.
And where there's such a mass population, mass religious population, it seems to be a very good way to do it.
Yeah, yeah, it's extremely effective,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah.
So I'm a bit conscious of time, so I'm just going to ask you the last question. And so what I want to ask now is there any sort of theorists or philosophers or writers or works of literature that you sort of find yourself coming back to, um, when you're, searching for an answer to something, or
Yeah.
any books that have been sort of heavily influential to you, sort of on your journey?
Yeah, I would say, I was thinking about this yesterday actually. I was asked a similar question. Um, the there's a writer called Todor Christov um, who I discovered kind of halfway through making this work, who, when, is one of those people that you read what they say and you're like, "Oh, that's what I was being kind of thinking, but wasn't able to put into words," and it suddenly clicks and makes sense. And he talks about, um, viewing the way he views conspiracy theorists is as kind of, I can't remember how he words it. I think he words it as kind of, I might have it written down actually. I don't know. I think I can't find it, but he frames them as deviant. So it's this idea of, his framing of it is this kind of intentional subversion of the status quo. So it's like he almost frames it as like a protest. And I think that's a very useful way to look at it. It I think it is easier. I think it provides more scope to dealing with the issue than it does just trying to deal with um, the contents. So it comes back to this idea of debunking and policing being useful. Obviously they're critical for there being a kind of counter to conspiracy theories out there, and it's, for many people they're probably very useful for clarifying. But in terms of actually trying to reach out to, or kind of communicate across this kind of border of conspiracy theorists and not, viewing them as a rejection of the status quo and a kind of a protest, I feel like that's a more productive way to begin conversation, because I think that allows people to kind of empathize with one another and allows you to kind of understand, even if obviously you don't agree with what they're saying. It feels like it's more productive to understand why they're doing what they're doing, and that feels to me like a more useful way of approaching the subject. And that's what I'm kind of trying to do with the work.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on. It's been very
Thank you. Yeah,
insightful,
thank you for having me.
and yeah, I hope you've had a good time. So I'm gonna end it there. Thank everyone for watching, and we'll be back soon.